art of engineering brought to a kind of fever pitch. And we like to think in the office, although our work isn't stylistically per se high-tech, although I come from that background both in terms of my education and interests, the idea of putting something together, constructing it, trying to understand something in an elegant and efficient kind of way that still has a kind of kunst or art or quality to it is something that we're obviously quite interested in. So the little byline about construction and commercial culture is a way also to let you know, and John touched on it a little bit, that we work in a commercial world. We claim that we're unassertive, that we're assertively uncommercial, but that we operate in this world. We don't have commissions outside of the commercial world. And to a certain extent, that's what I want to try to bring together in the work, and that's what I want to try to bring together in the talk. And to a certain extent, these images and these things from sort of German engineering culture were not what I sort of found and meditated on for a while and then invented the work. A lot of it comes through in a kind of parallel process, and even to a certain extent in a kind of reverse engineered process to kind of play with the idea on German engineering. The last thing you would imagine German engineers to do is reverse engineer anything. They would probably have the idea that there is a program and there's a solution, and I don't think that that's an epithet or a kind of a marginalizing view of, let's say, the German engineer. The German engineer is an inventive person. So we also think of things in our daily lives like Leica cameras, or not so daily life oriented, which is a wing for a parachutist invented by the ESG company that allows for military use to be dropped out of a plane and then actually fly to where you need to get to first, and then sort of drop the parachute down so that the plane can get out of the way. And it's a bit of a stealth proposition. Just I don't know, cool idea. But I want to begin essentially through an architectural regime. In this case, it's a kind of vernacular form of building known as Fachwerk. Fachwerk is a term that essentially translates in English, not directly, but in everyday use, to timber construction or half-timber construction. Fachwerk is I like the word. It sounds like something you'd say after you stub your toe, Fachwerk. And really the talk is an excuse to use the word Fach a lot. This picture on the right is by Bern and Hilla Becker. If you know photography at all, you know that this team, they photograph in a kind of typological fashion, very plain-spoken buildings, blast furnaces, and so forth. They're always taken on gray afternoons. There's never any sun. They're very, very diffuse. They're always sort of flat, two-dimensional images, and they're cataloged very, very directly. And I really, really appreciate that. And a lot of people might not associate that level of, let's say, directness or soberness with what we do. But I also think John touched on it a little bit. There's an economy with the work that we're always trying to achieve that's sort of deeply embedded in these very plain-spoken, very, very forthright buildings. But the thing that really made me ask questions were about the construction itself and why, of course, the frame is exposed. And it's a pretty simple process. It's very, very heavy timber construction, and forgive me if you're already have studied this deeply in history. I didn't get to it. Very heavy timber construction, sort of like a cabinet with mortise and tenon joints. A series of kind of structural bents or structural surfaces can be lined up. The perimeter of a building, heavily articulated. You'll also see diagonals that don't quite go to the corner of a quote-unquote panel joint. They're sort of odd and offset, probably because doing a kind of knee brace intersection requires maybe excessive kind of construction, and when you can avoid it, bay. And it's not, in this case, 3 floors, but a very, very large volume. And this is, of course, the expression. We all know it. We all know it either from our direct experience in places like Germany or England or possibly Switzerland, or maybe we know it in a strange American vernacular in theme parks and so forth, because let's face it, you know, these kinds of images sort of translate into forms of memory and identity differently than, let's say, just a brick house would. So it's curious that the graphic quality of this connects to people, let's say. It connects in a certain way because there's a legibility, it's almost an X-ray, right, of how the building is built. There's no skin. All of the material sits in the infill of the frame. And you know, from the 13th century on, quite often they used a kind of black paint or tar over the frame. A hardcore black and white project. And the black and white project is also very, very important for me because it probably connects to the idea of the graphic more than it immediately connects to the idea of architecture. What's the black and white project in architecture? We know the white project, we may know the black project, but what's the black and white project in the equivalent of this today? Well, that's the most famous Fachwerk building I know at this point, the OMA project in Beijing. It's the CCTV. Now, it's not wood, but we translate, obviously, the perimeter of the building and the infill of the glass and the fact that OMA didn't put a skin over the building. And we know many diamond grid projects from today which, you know, wrap the skin and don't bother kind of articulating the line work, but like Seattle Library and this building, there's a sensibility which sort of says, you know, we want to be able to tell the story of the strains and stresses on the perimeter of the building in that kind of Dutch pragmatic way, saying this is all we need to do. The facade basically is the structure and the facade is the engineering of the project, and all we need to do is sort of infill around this because, you know, you just need a kind of spandrel condition here on the diagonals, and actually the spandrel conditions at the floor obviously kind of disappear within the diamond. If we had a kind of striated world here, it would be a little less like the idea of the Fachwerk project, whereas this one is quite powerful. But you know, OMA, and you know this technique of sort of producing the silhouette, the sophisticated engineering project can obviously be reduced, in this case, by their own hands to that of an icon or a 2D figure, rendering the building somewhere between immediate recognition and here on the cover of A+U, the black and white project, the lines of the Fachwerk frame floating on the infill, here obviously not playing out that kind of logic. But it's out there in terms of architecture, and I wanted to use that not only as a historical source, but to try to begin to track the relationship between that which is taboo in architecture, probably aspatial, not having to do with inhabitation, but having to do more with the idea of media reception and a more passive way of experiencing space. That is, through cinema, through screens, and so forth, where the illusion of depth is given to you and projected to you. In our project in Tokyo in 1996, we weren't interested, obviously, in expressing a frame, because at that time the question was beginning to be, how do we submerge the frame in the skin? Because if the Fachwerk project does one thing, in the graphic sense, it also materializes the basic primitive and primary relationship between infill and frame. And we know people like Mies and Kahn and many, many others who expressed, you know, a modernist architectural frame and filled it with glass or brick. So here we were interested in surface. Surface as a very expansive idea, surface that had obviously its own kind of framing logic within it. And in this kind of limited gallery space, the line work of the Fachwerk project finds itself at the ends of these extrusions and on local conditions. In this case, this extrusion, very small extrusion, perpendicular to the point of entry. These extrusions rotated 90 degrees. The Cartesian and the orientation of this within this box, and with the idea that you've got a kind of enveloping strange space when you're standing in it, but sort of like a Brechtian play, the idea where he wants you to not really feel like you're being seduced into fiction. He really wants you to say, I'm sitting in a theater, I'm watching a play, there's no imitation of a particular kind of sensibility of reality. And in this case, we're not in the space, we're looking at essentially a kind of drawn profile. And for everybody who knows our work, this is where a lot of the ambition came from, which was how to articulate the idea that something could be immediate, something could be radically simple, something could be read as immediately as a sort of an icon, but how could it also, at the same time and at the very same moment, be a projection of a deep complexity of space? So our work is not reduced to a 2D graphic project. Yet I feel like what we're always trying to do is slip architecture in between the world of architecture as a conservative guardian of space, because we're the last ones to build space and everybody else gets rid of it, or create an illusion of it. And somewhere between that world and the world of the graphic, for which we experience in different sorts of ways and in different sorts of time frames. So the extrusion project here sort of becomes a much, much more manipulated surface, to the point where the profiles aren't working in the elevation to read necessarily the thickness of the envelope. This is just simply a cutout to be able to make a very, very large window facing south in this small house that we designed in 1997. Yet in relation to this bigger surface, we do have the legibility of the surface, its profile, its shift from the wall thickness to the floor thickness, and even greater depth, the expression of one type of construction and a kind of soffit construction here. So we've been very interested for a long time in how to fuse a very, very hardcore tectonic project, a very hardcore constructive project, with things that might linger to the eye as being immaterial, as being quick, as being a lot about the 2D. In the case of a project in Palm Springs, we only have one line basically in the whole project, a roof. Everything else is sort of deeply submerged underneath. But as we express the line here, this is a proposal for a water-cooled roof in a system in Palm Springs. The actual profile of the line becomes descriptive of two things. One, the idea of movement of water and air, and number two, a corrugated extrusion, which is of course going to allow the greatest amount of cantilever in this kind of steel construction. And further, in 2002, I believe this was a competition we did in Ireland for an art center, where the profiles of the kind of surface corrugation here, in this case the building being constructed in concrete, and these bays having to do with the demands of the program in this kind of open gallery space. Essentially in this kind of whole collaborative world, will also essentially deal with the idea of depth in very, very, let's say, manifold sorts of ways. Glass which is flush to the perimeter of the profile of the concrete, but an inverted radius here which debosses this surface, not quite a complete infill, a simple infill. So we're trying to kind of generate relationships, probably in a fairly straightforward modernist way, about response to the program, and of course here even two bays which in this kind of migrating set of extrusions, and even one big one, begin to kind of set this off and collaborate as a total kind of project. Line and infill, this didn't come from FactFolk. Again, the FactFolk project is not, oh, here's where all the ideas come from. I reverse engineered it after sort of meditating on the idea of the black and white project for quite a long time. And while this is not structure per se, and here we enter into whatever world of illusion or postmodernism, because this isn't about playing out construction at an honest level, especially in interior where you're usually dealing with you know, studs and drywall and so forth. Clearly it's about a graphic proposition where the convergence of this surface in a coplanar way with a half-inch reveal, finding its sort of reemergence back deep within the space. This particular moment, this kind of aleph point in this space in Beverly Hills for Endeavor, is also a way in which the surface, because this is a surface-dominant project, reveals itself as a kind of framework. In this case, the frame becomes an enclosure for the infill for these aluminum panels, that itself begins to migrate into a much deeper, more complex, more time-based series of surfaces and spaces. So the German stuff was a way to try to articulate that in let's say, a whole other series of elements. And I'll go further, and the theories may become more crackpot-oriented, but that's my job. You know, on a very, very visual level, I have a deep and profound connection between these two things from 2 points of view. Number one, the black and white project. The black and white project, sorry to focus on it so much, but if the black and white project isn't about contrast, I don't know what it is. If it's not about resonance, I don't know what it is. If it's not about sort of afterburn, I don't know what it is, because all of these things are sort of set up for memory. Now the last thing this thing is set up for is memory. This agenda is a plain spoken, let's build it, we'll just put the infill. We would use far too much energy if we tried to skin, you know, the building, so we'll just express the frame. Whereas this, of course, is about selling, this is about memory, it's about imprint. And for me, this is a kind of an early version of sort of saying, if a building could be honest in the way in which it's put together, the building could be hardcore, yet still have tendencies to be experienced and read which weren't about strictly that level of directness or honesty, if it could be overcoded in some way, this is what we're trying to do with our projects. So the Beetle in its very early incarnation, you know, the Volkswagen, the people's car, the car which is direct, the car which has nothing ornamental, and we know that that's essentially the launch of the whole brand of Volkswagen itself. And it retains in our memory, I think, that kind of identity. Further kind of articulated in the 60s with the Volkswagen bus in a hyper-articulated world, almost a little piece of architecture, still highly graphic in the high contrast world. Here the red and white project could be black, could be yellow, we've seen them all. An almost unthinkable level of perforation. There's hardly any opaque surface. It's like, let's get more skylights, let's have an operable skylight, let's be able to sort of open the whole thing up. Truly, truly sort of great and kind of pragmatic. No wonder, you know, so many people want to buy these vintage things. They're really amazing. Now, today's Volkswagen, it's almost like, is that a Volkswagen? That's the new CC Passat. Hardly right of them to call it a Passat. It looks, you know, super expensive. It's doesn't have the same aura of the Beetle or even of some of the other models, because they need to get into a sort of affordable luxury car program. So at one level, it's interesting to note how a company which needs its memory afterburn through the logo, the black and white project, the simple project, wants to keep upping the ante in terms of complexity and sophistication. I would say we're trying to do that in our work, to retain some identity of the plain-spokenness, the directness, the hardcore, but how far can we push it? It's interesting, here's the interior for the CC. I've never seen a sort of high-contrast interior like this. Now, is it coincidental, or can I start a conspiracy of some sort about the black and white project and, you know, it taking over the whole world, and I was the first to propagate it? And I'm trying to kind of figure this out a little bit. Of course, I want to buy this car because this car is our project at some level. I can't figure out why the light-colored leather is probably where the dirty parts would be, your body and so forth, and this isn't the light part, but that just proves that Volkswagen probably isn't as concerned at times about a certain type of rigor. I show you these images also because I want to make a super direct link. I don't want any synapses to be closed. I want this to represent the previous images. And in many respects they do, and that's part of why I'm trying to drive something so clearly, and why over the course of a week we were asked to do a project, strangely and oddly enough, for GQ magazine to do a Bank of the Future in Japan. And of course this is the moment when the architect says, we're doing the black and white project, you know, come hell or high water, and we're going to explore smoothness, the window and the opaque surface as sort of similar but low contrast worlds, because I'll get into low contrast as a corollary, I think, to the rest of the talk, and into a world of poche and void, and the interactivity of the poche and the void relative to the way in which the space works. And here's a particular example of a kind of carved space, super articulated with what we imagine to be the biggest, fattest, driest gaskets ever extruded for anyone to be able to really dramatize the threshold between that which is transparent and that which is opaque. Now Porsche, we all know Porsche, and I come at it from a particular sort of romantic view, mostly through the 60s icon Steve McQueen. Died in 1980, he was 50, he had cancer, it was sad, but he left a lot of sort of manly movies about, and he was a racer, and he was quite interested in taking this racing obsession to the movies. And this particular 917, which they developed in 1970 and 71 for the Le Mans series, funded partly by Gulf Motors and designed by the Porsche team and also a man named John Wyer from London. They produced this 917 Courchette. Courchette means short tail, and they'd experimented with long tails, and in this case it's a different type of profile at the back end of the car than at the front end of the car. 1,100 horsepower, 4.5 liters. It was then 2 years later demanded that all these cars come down to 3 liters. This is a still from Steve McQueen's movie from 1971, Le Mans. One of my favorite movies. My favorite types of movies are really long, really slow, not much dialogue. And for most of you, that sounds really boring. For me, that's 2.5 hours of nobody in my face, and I just get to watch the movie. And in this case, it was really, really, for him, a kind of meditation on the love of racing, Steve McQueen. And for me, it finally translated into some very, very clear thinking. All the aerodynamics, of course, I can't speak about. All of the nuances of the surface geometry can't speak about. The only thing I can kind of speak about is from an architectural point of view, and also from a sort of graphicist point of view. You know, the colors coming from Gulf, which were the baby blue and the orange, they could put the colors on any way they want, but of course the color has to go on to make the car look fast. And so therefore this kind of almost slipstream over the top, that's logical for racing cars. But once you get into the idea that two things are going on. One, there's a continuous surface set to a set of conditions which are of course very, very precise. And the second thing is surfaces doing different things, and obviously the opaque surfaces and the glaze surfaces, just like in our GQ bank or just like in your building that you designed in studio, do different things. Vision glass, in this case the glass here isn't for human vision but for electronic vision, electric vision. The graphics identifying, you know, the number, the black and white project hiding within there and so forth. And various levels of kind of strokes or black lines, in this case gaskets, wrapping around the different parts of the car. We know that from car manufacturing. But what's interesting for me are these big, fat, ugly, primitive, not very cool looking big pieces of tape, because say they go around 3 laps, it's raining, they'll strip that off in a heartbeat. There's another layer of plastic down, and they have several layers of plastic that allow the the lights to kind of go through very easily. It's too hard to kind of get out and clean the glass every time they're coming in. For me, this is like the fact project. This is about the plain spokenness of saying this is how we do it, and this is what needs to happen, happening within the most luxurious, the most beautiful object, one of the best things I've ever seen, and those things collaborated together. This is what we would like to do with our project. Finally, Adidas, or in Europe, it's Adidas. And what to say? First of all, I need to say I'm an Adidas man. I don't wear Nike. I don't wear Puma. I only wear Adidas. For no reason other than it was part of the memory of growing up and getting the Adidas superstars and so forth. That's Adi Dassler. Started the company in 1949 after a bitter argument with his brother, who started Puma and kind of had a store across the street, basically. Sarah Graham is actually an expert. Her office did the master plan for the campus, and we were involved in a competition. Now, possibly the best shoe ever designed, in my estimation. The Adidas Superstar. There's Jerry West in 1972 during the year that they won 30 straight games. This is the Chauncey Billups Las Vegas. I think a bit of an overstatement in terms of the name. It doesn't look super Las Vegas. It looks sort of Oakland Raiders to me, with the silver and black. And I think that's pretty cool and pretty sinister. Our project for Adidas, which we revised to fit the Oakland Raiders model, we took the project submitted in 1992 and we re-rendered it recently to essentially make the project a different project, simply because we conceived of the way in which the project would work graphically. It sits on a site that determined the building as a triangle because of the loose nature of the site, and also that the parking didn't want to create a front and a back to the building. And then we applied a series of kind of graphics to the project to dramatize the fact that this building is meant to be a very big, plain-spoken kind of Ross's Dress for Less, because it's an outlet store. And here from the front, with this sort of the money going into the dramatic cantilever, otherwise essentially a giant box, super straightforward, direct, and essentially trying to kind of squeeze out everything in a kind of direct, efficient way. This is one of our first and only projects that we could do in Germany, and this was our second one, which we got to build. And our Passat CC got turned into a Beetle because of value engineering. And it's meant to be this. This is a mobile theater for a radical art group called EBM in Berlin, who we built this building for and helped them design this pixel room in this kind of near Atari world. The content was about fear and oppression in the police state. But we were literally producing very flat, straightforward panels which could be stacked up like potato chips in a super honest and super direct kind of way. There was a strange feeling that something had come over us from the exotic nature. By the way, they asked us to make something as strange as possible, to defamiliarize the box. This is a 4.5 meter tall box, and they asked us to try to make it as odd as possible, even with within the constraints of having to take it apart and put it on 10 trucks. This wasn't a tent or a temporary building. It literally had to be rebuilt again and again. So the budget demanded that we finally make the kind of lower end model. So I'm going to show you a few projects that, with that as a kind of preamble, hopefully you'll be able to find a connection between these ideas or these references. The first one is in New York. It's our second project in New York. It's at the intersection of Lafayette, Crosby, and Houston Street. This is Broadway. This is essentially on a cruciform between Greenwich Village, Soho, and the Lower East Side. And if you know New York, this is a bit of a famous site. It's a site where this giant billboard is attached to a rather dilapidated although historically controlled loft building right next to a relatively ersatz new building, sadly for Adidas. Nonetheless, our project was to essentially grab this footprint, an almost Japanese-sized footprint, and essentially build a volume that would connect back to this building. Of course, our client is the owner of this building. We were asked to respect the possibility of putting the billboard on the facade of our project, as the billboard essentially brings in near $500,000 a year. This is, I think, a project that can fall into the category of the German projects, in the sense that all it is a zoning envelope volume with two things going on. We've got a stair that's connecting to the F train that we have to get around. We can't enclose the stair on the interior. We have to add an elevator that goes down to the station here. So we simply bevel the corner, slope it back, make the bevel sort of grow or migrate in terms of size, articulate the front facade and the side facades with a kind of edge band of clear finish aluminum, essentially paste the corner together with black anodized aluminum. And what we think we get out of it is a high economy, big payoff project, where if you don't look too close, you'll think it's a pretty interesting building. If you look rather closely, it's a plain-spoken, 5-story steel structure that simply connects back to this building. And in this moment, we sort of believe that there's a lot of payoff in expression. And also, because we have an 18-foot tall first floor, the kind of super scale nature of these moves, as the rest of the building sort of goes beyond your peripheral vision, nobody looks up anymore in New York. Really, what you experience, what you imagine you experience, is this sort of crazy building dropping into New York because it doesn't conform to the block. And clearly that's part of what became attractive for the client, because of its simplicity of building, but its also effect at street level. Our project in the Highline is at 23rd Street, a kind of major avenue that moves across the site. Amazing view of pre-9/11 New York. Almost looks like a rendering a little bit because of the kind of coloration, but you see the incredible networked density of the project, of the island. And the Highline and 23rd Street represent a kind of interesting now cruciform. 23rd Street is a major boulevard, Flatiron Building, Madison Square, Chelsea Hotel, London Terrace, like one of the biggest brick apartment buildings, and the Highline, which is running about 50 yards to the west of 10th Avenue, and our site is at that corner. Now, Chelsea had its day. It's now got a new day. Had a new day, then the economy tanked, and now its day is a little bit troubled, and our building made it into the, it was like a test tube baby. It got put in the hot oven in the bubble long enough, and it could grow. But these are the people who sort of hung out in Chelsea back in the day: William Burroughs, firearms expert, Bob Dylan, Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote 2001 while in. These are all Chelsea Hotel people, and I'm older now, and these are my references, and I'm happy to kind of let you in on them. Here is the site for the project. It's a block-through site. We're looking south. 4.5 years ago, London Terrace, 10th Avenue, and the views up and down the Highline, which will essentially remain in perpetuity for anyone living in the building. And I'll explain the agendas of how we kind of responded to that. But basically, our client sort of understood that the site could be developable if these views were to be capitalized on in the project. But the main thing to tell you was that the as-of-right volume of the building, which is 25 feet wide and 145 feet tall, was not acceptable for our client. And he said, if you can design a building which is much bigger, and in this case he wanted around 50% more square footage than what you could obviously get out of the site, he promised that he would build it. When a developer makes a promise to you you know, that early with only a, you know, a little bit of money on the line, you don't believe any of it. So it's a bit shocking that somehow we find ourselves building this project. So at the end of the day, we have 7 variations, 7 waivers on the project, 5 feet longer, another floor. Instead of stepping back in wedding cake fashion, we asked to be able to build on the sky plane. We're not adhering to the street face, primarily because we can't, because there's a spur that enters the site. And prior to this sort of Highline project, this site was probably thought to be undevelopable by almost anyone. And when it suddenly became an amazing project, every square inch of New York, every square meter could finally become thought to make a project on it, not unlike Tokyo. Our most sort of egregious moment is where we, of course, go past 25 feet, and as you'll see in the building sections, this is a lot of volume that we ask for. The condition of the site, very challenging. This is a relatively new building by Lindy Roy, the kind of more banal building across the street on 23rd. Here's the spur that enters the site, creating this kind of small notch, and the conditions and the logistics as you can imagine them to work on. This is the most telling section. With all of the waivers, we're essentially working both with and against what the city and what city planning and what the Friends of the Highline and Special Chelsea zoning was asking us to do or forcing us to work against. So this profile right here, because we knew we were going to violate it, 15 feet setback was what was required. This was the moment where sort of our own kind of curiosity about geometry and form, the facade next to the Highline was going to essentially collaborate with all of the other surfaces that had been essentially excavated or found almost in the project. That slope is more or less found. It's the sky plane setback, and the shape of the rest of the building is completely based on the conditions of the site. So the Highline literally kind of dives right into our site, and the building splits into 2 bays here. Well, it's 2 bays all the way down, and that's essentially determined by the space between the spur and the edge of the site, and continues on up. And you'll see a number of images, and I know you can't help but think of the Fachwerk project at this point straight away. Our client asked us to make a curtain wall on the south and on the north, even after we proposed elaborate sort of louver systems to control the sun, which was rejected because louvers aren't part of the condominium language in New York, i.e. they won't sell. So we had to go to high performance glass and so forth. What we proposed straight away to the engineer, to D. Simone, our great engineers in New York, which was to span the diagonals between 3 and 4 floors to be able to make the building look taller than what it really is, to try to undermine the horizontals as much as possible, and essentially to do that partially by a 2D graphic system of the frit within the glass. The kind of precursor project was one that we were working on in New York, which was killed because of 9/11, was also a one bay wide building here, 28 feet wide. Same program, 1 apartment per floor, and this was on Union Square North. So we kind of got our feet wet a little bit in a project for which our client said, we need to make an affordable building, but we need to have the most amount of sort of impression in the city. So we developed a 6-foot square piece of glass that could actually be fritted and mirrored to be able to create a kind of consistent but very loosely kind of migrating pattern of the building. So the elements of the graphic in the glass had been there, in that case much more extreme. Here what we thought we would do is pursue the project of essentially reiterating the plain spokenness of the structure. These are 8-inch steel tubes about a foot behind the glass. Again, you'll notice, just like the Fachwerk project, we send a diagonal sort of different than what you might usually find in terms of conventional framing, where you would have a kind of chevron between every bay. And of course, we had to resist both gravitational and lateral forces in all three exposed sides of the building because it's cantilevered, as you can see, however, sort of mildly. It goes from a 32-foot wide building here to a 5-foot wide building here over the course of about 145 feet. And the building is eccentrically loaded in the other direction as well. So it sort of wants to fall over to the east this way and twist as it goes. So the entire perimeter, of course, we knew would have to be braced. And we proposed this to the engineer, and we thought basically he might laugh at us. He said, no, it makes a lot of sense. And it makes enough sense, especially because he understood the project about trying to make the building like a 3 or 4 bay tall building rather than a 14-story building. And our client finally understood to what effect the graphics of this would affect the reading of the project in terms of a proposal for it being taller and slimmer in many ways than what it really is. Here's a view of the ground floor, small gallery space on the side. Very, very microscopic sort of Japanese scale lobby. We have a very hardcore circulation system, as small as possible, loaded to the west of the building. This, of course, is a giant vertical column with a lot of shear panels in it, as you'll see. This is a Corian, kind of thermoform Corian screen between the lobby and a small art gallery up above. On the north side, we have a super flush facade completely articulated by the first sort of line of metal panel fascia, which of course is thick at the top to hold the parapet for the terrace. Slims down to a dimension that essentially encases or encloses the mega panels that are laid onto the steel frame. We split the surface on the east because, of course, that's where we have latitude, and we can allow small windows up to the north from the middle bedrooms. Otherwise, completely 2D sort of expression. At the base, we've got a duplex with an exterior terrace, and the view to the north from one of the master bedrooms, which is on the western bay, the smaller bay. You can kind of see the relationship between the kind of halo or doppelganger of the structure, very straightforward. Our structure will be intumescent painted to be as small as possible, and very, very large 6-foot by 5-foot operable windows. There's the structural frame. At the end of the day, it's actually an incredibly efficient and very, very light building as a totality. Again, most of these members are in the 8 to 10 inch category, very small. The logistics of the site were typically a truck would pull up here, the crane is on the other side, the west side, picking up pieces from the east side, lifting it over, rotating and dropping it down into this very, very small slot, and you can see the building starting to take shape and cantilever. The interesting thing about the structure is 7 floors of steel are up right now. The building is being pulled over by guy cables, and a whole series of sloping columns have an additional camber placed in them. As the building is being pulled to be able to essentially hold it plumb, they'll come back in and pour all of the floors to make the kind of diaphragm nature of the building actually come into place and be rigid. They decided, the erection engineer decided to do that to be able to hold the tolerances of the location of the steel down to what we wanted. Right now we're talking all the steel is within 1/4 of an inch of where it's supposed to be, which we here in New York has never really been done, just because we're so alien in New York. LA guys going out and proving in a funny way that we're pretty tough, at least in terms of building a project. So here's the relationship to the Highline, the stepping back of the building, and you can see the diagonal framing in different guises. The only place where we have exposed steel is when it's around a pipe. And you can see that sort of Fachwerk style here and absolutely in the face of the building. So all of these will be exposed within the interior. These are all essentially concealed. And the effect that we want is floor-to-ceiling glass, and as you'll see, what we're trying to also do with the spandrels is make them recede. Here's the 13th and 14th floor of the penthouse. The building is getting sort of wider, going toward almost a more square shape terrace on the 14th floor. And there's the view with a 13-foot ceiling here. From the very beginning, we wanted to push the spandrels back behind the glass. It's not the first time it's been done, but just so we can get one piece of glass to go from floor to floor. I wouldn't recommend that unless you've got a lot of persistence, because it's quite difficult. This is one of our first mock-ups in Shenzhen that we went to go see, and we were studying different opacities of frit from 100% to 80%, 90%, whether we were going to use black anodized or clear anodized silicone colors and so forth. So here's a section where the building folds at the 10th floor. The structural frame you can see here, the tubes expressed inside, a relatively thin floor package, and a lot of effort to be able to make the spandrel sort of go away. And what's happening is these steel tubes are being custom fabricated in China where the glass is being made. It's what we call a spreader beam. These mullions are steel and they're welded to entirely this surface behind the spreader beam. So this as a total panel can be dropped onto the project, and while we're only pushing a spandrel back, the depth of the mullion, it's still enough to give us a reading that the glass goes from floor to floor. And the surface of this is also bead blasted stainless steel. This is the performance mock-up. This is not a visual mock-up. This is out on Long Island where they're doing water testing and so forth. This is the atlas for all the mega panels for the glass, and there's one mega panel that you see. This is also in China. So these things are essentially prefabricated, and they'll be dropped on the building in kind of just-in-time fashion. And the good thing about this besides it being a kind of process to be able to speed up erection time, the one great thing about this spreader beam is there's no movement between each one of these pieces of glass. There's only movement at the perimeter of the spreader, of the mega panel. So we've got about an inch joint here, and we've got 3/4 of an inch joint here. So there's no movement, no racking between the pieces of glass. If you were to put each individual piece of glass on a stick frame, all the pieces of glass would move around when you got interstory drift, or you dead loaded or live load into the building. So it makes for a very tight set of details within the field. That's the mega panel we were seeing there, and the whole system for the east facade. The east facade is stainless steel. It's a stamp system on top of a very, very basic kind of stud system with build-up with insulation, etc., with punched windows prefabricated. Some of our first efforts we did with Zaner, where we were trying to figure out if they could do what we wanted, and we explored very early on some folded systems. We told them to emboss it, just see what we would get out of it. And at a certain point after these exercises, we decided we wanted to do a smooth panel, and Zaner wasn't quite so absolutely adept to do it. Number one, they were going to ask us to put a hairline joint in the middle of the panel. The panels are 11.5 feet long, and we didn't want that. Our consultants front in New York found the group TC in Buenos Aires, who wisely or unwisely took the job to make these 11.5 foot long panels. There's about a 1-inch deformation here, and essentially these things kind of recur to make a very, very soft kind of diamond grid. This is an MDF painted mock-up that we made in Los Angeles, and we shipped it off. This is the final panel, and one thing anecdotally I'll say about it is we milled the dies, they stamped the first panels, and the shape memory of the material would not allow the ends of the deformation to happen. In other words, where there wasn't enough deformation, the steel wasn't getting crushed enough, the atomic structure of it wasn't getting disturbed, and so it would go back to flat. And so our initial efforts were we only saw deformation about this far. So we actually had to go in, add another layer of steel to both sides of the dies, and then re-mill in an exaggerated profile so that we could actually accommodate the spring back of stainless steel. Just a word if you're going to do that. As they say in Argentina, the stainless steel is very diabolical. Very diabolical. This is a small house project that we did in the west side of LA and finished it in 2007. Typical house, 1940, 1,000 square feet, an existing garage for which 2 children were living in. And this was the world that we encountered, a renovated garage with the 2 girls, one third daughter in the existing house. The older daughter had a better scenario. This is the living room. And essentially, as we found out and as it unfolded, the family had become sick of living in this house for possibly obvious reasons. The warm and fuzzy world of child rearing had suddenly given way to teenagers, and it wasn't quite so warm and fuzzy anymore. And everybody wanted to have a kind of more grown-up house, if not sober, then something new and fresh, and somehow for them what they wanted was Zen. We added 1,000 square feet on 2 floors in the back, gave them back their garage, plugged 3 girls into the existing house, renovated the bathroom, and a brand new sort of gargantuan kitchen for the size house it is. And for a family that does no cooking, it's pretty interesting, but they love it. Here's the section. And the one thing I want to point out about the specifics of the project in the section, we have a series of contingencies about the floor heights, the elevation of the backyard, which you can see is about 7 feet below. This ceiling height's only 7'9", and everything in section here is sort of articulated based on the site conditions. But the existing house will actually disappear in about 5 to 7 years, and will essentially continue rebuilding from this as the existing house into a kind of a complete and total project, which we're working on now. So you have to remember that this project is a kind of multiple phase project. We're in the existing footprint. Here's this super clean modernist kitchen, and it begins to be clear about the kind of very simple sectional relationships to the exterior that we have here. The slot of space between the backyard and the living room as opposed to the upper part of the house articulated here. The structure, which is essentially also a kind of line between the new and the old, and the profile of the house. Now, the logic of this is, it's not the Fachwerk project to the extent that a reveal can become a line, which also has the intent to become structural, but in this case it's only structuring graphics. It's only structuring the 2D, and I would like to allow us as architects to be able to work in this particular fashion in a new and direct way, a very simple way, as well as sort of understanding the soberness of how real structure, forthright structure works. And this is a lot of the ambition of our project. These 2 windows, this window is shaped this way so that you can stand in the kitchen and look out at this really beautiful coral tree. It's a 60-year-old coral tree, very, very large. It limited the size of the house. And this profile is actually a profile that articulates the slope out. It's very, very much a tree that's arborescent in this fashion. So these are completely based on perspectival and very 2D framed kinds of views. So there's actually an internal logic to how they work. This is another addition that we're working on, plugged on to the end of the house, very much inspired by and connected to the same sort of set of emotions and agendas, to a certain extent using a bit more articulation in terms of how solid and void work here in this kind of beveled industrial design, kind of relief between the solid surface and the glazed surface. And very quickly, a few projects in the Asian slipstream, and then I'll let you go. A huge project, which was a competition. I don't know who won yet. I think Tom and Rem are in the finals. This is in Taipei. This is a very important train line, a train station, bifurcating the field between a green mountain and a kind of landscape of existing and very, very new kind of tall postmodern towers, a night market that's quite nearby. Here's the view of the site, which is right here from the train station. We're looking in the same direction. We're looking to the north. These are the kinds of buildings that are in the periphery. And so what we simply tried to do was create a mirror along the street of the morphology of the mountain, and a mountain with our building. And the second agenda was to block out the view of these buildings. If we were going to do anything, that's what we were going to go for. Not only does this almost become a very, very clear mirror between the site, one of the most kind of contextual projects that we've done, this type of shopping system and shopping street, and entry underneath into two theaters that are underneath the big stacked theater, with essentially a kind of surface of perforation and lighting that we hope also gives it a kind of arborescent or flora and fauna similar to the site. So a linear building morphs into a sort of a giant wrapped building that has 3 or 4 different types of relationships to the street. There you can see the backside, which is sort of the service side of the main theater. The whole plaza is completely open and accessible, kind of main thoroughfares going all the way through the building. And there's a big slot between the main theater and the lobbies and the tops of the theaters below. 2 theaters, a multi-purpose and a smaller proscenium theater, organized in a super clear way, all the services below. And rotated 90 degrees on a different axis is the bigger hall, 1,500 seats, all the services in the background. So this just becomes wrapped by this giant kind of mountain envelope. There's the interior of the theater and the elevations. And I don't need to say too much about these drawings in the sense that they pretty much in a one-to-one way represent, to a certain extent, the whole preamble of the talk. That the relationship between specific and very, very simple templates and lines here become deeper and more articulated with the way in which certain types of radial conditions work, certain types of infill joints work, the resultant types of sort of very cinematic openings, relationships between the thickness of surfaces which shift from zone to zone, from a kind of cornice here into just simply a vertical surface here. What we're trying to do is essentially make a project which has immediate and visceral sets of graphic kind of memory agitators. At the same time, we want buildings that unfold in a level of complexity like a lot of us are searching for. Here's the large void that literally goes through the middle of the building. It's actually a bubble. You can't get into that void if you're going into the main auditorium. You get into that bubble and you go up to an upper floor shopping system. Otherwise, you're sort of circulating around it. Another huge project in Almaty, Kazakhstan, which was a commission that has problems with the economy. We're in a strange, blown-out world of new redevelopment. The center of town is actually right here. It's a very, very strange city, Almaty. Not unlike China in its kind of rush and ambition to build quite a lot. This is a twin tower by Norman Foster. This is the Norman Foster project right here. So actually their rendering in this kind of grass lawn is right in the middle of our site. We're looking back to them as neighbors only a few meters away. This is the interior courtyard. Based on wind capture and also views, you see the amazing mountain range. So what we were dealing with essentially is like being, you know, like the short kid behind the big guy with the afro in the theater. Can we see? So we had to push as much of the project away from it. We used the office building, which was less important in terms of views than all of this housing, as a kind of on the one hand, edge to the whole site. We've got an opening that goes through the middle of our office building so that you could circulate all the way through the site. And here it is. So the office building becomes a kind of permissible line into the site. After all, these sites are just so big and so autonomous, and everybody's just doing their kind of weird ersatz thing, and we had to contend with the fact that, of course, we have architectural agendas, but we were working really hard to try to understand the perimeter of the block, the relationship between the Foster project, being able to sort of contort and twist the housing to be able to get as good a views as possible, even if you were back here looking through this corridor. By the way, these are floor-through units, so you have views to the interior and above and also out. And you can see the connectivity directly. It's a very, very cold climate, and so we proposed a whole series of kind of skywalks and sky bridges. This L piece is a small shopping center, all the parking below grade. The roof is a semi-public space with the kind of full complement of green technology. And some of the later developments that we did where we were trying to extend this graphic figure, for the reality of the project, the whole facade essentially wants to be glass to capture the view. It wants to be glass to be able to let in the most amount of light and heat. And yet we weren't content with sort of making glass railings and storefront sliders and just sort of call it a day. So we tried to kind of develop apartments and articulate different ways in which the dimensionality of the balcony system, as well as this kind of graphic system of a winter garden, these have had operable glazing systems, to try to make the project have a kind of quality that we knew would be very, very different from everything else in the landscape. This was a competition that we just lost to, I don't know who we lost it to, but we came in second. This is for AU. It's like the Verizon of Japan. And this moves us back into a type of commercial project that, on the one hand, is deeply connected to sort of plain spokenness in everyday life, the idea of cell phones and so forth. They asked for well, we proposed this kind of dense LED louver system for the project. But mostly what we were interested in was the new way in which you could go into a store and essentially use a kiosk that would be credit card activated. So you could buy or rent a cell phone. You go into a cell phone store and all the phones are dead, right? They're just objects. You can't get on them. You can't play with them. Unlike an Apple store where you can at least flip up the machine and play with it. So our ambition was to essentially bring the phone to life. You could rent or buy and walk straight out, go up to one of these vending machines. These are all the new models. And essentially meander through the space and through a series of ramps, move all the way up into the second floor of the space where you can actually sit down and play in lounge areas, talk to customer reps and so forth. The vending machines, of course, could migrate into these small micro stores and in different types of landscapes, even including vans that could pick you up if you wanted to actually go to the flagship store and connect. I'll show you one more project and then we'll end. This is for a bank in Nagoya, Japan. We did 5 banks, and this facade was one of the most ambitious efforts we were able to kind of pull off in this whole system, an existing 2-story building. And with this facade, black painted steel, 2D up here, perforated, dramatically 3D at the vestibule, as you see here. What we're simply trying to do is, if the most two-dimensional aspect of the facade is something that your body's not going to touch it sounds pretty obvious. You're just going to look at it. It's the part about architecture where it's not tactile, but only visually tactile. We wanted to try to just produce a graphic project, the black and white project, in the 2D 5mm perforated material, and translate that in a flush surface into that which is super deep, super visceral, curved, industrial design, about the body, about touching it, about this becoming a kind of portal and very, very ergonomic. And the relationship between that as sort of proper architecture and that essentially as a 2D system of graphic identity. Of course, it's a screen, but I wanted to relegate it into the thinnest possible material. So we worked very hard to create a flush system. These are bent aluminum pieces, and these corner pieces right here are actually cast aluminum. So we've got 2 thicknesses of steel, flat and bent, and 3 pieces of cast aluminum, all painted black and put into a flush facade. Clearly the project was about trying to essentially privilege the absolute surface continuity between the 2D and the 3D. The lower floor is an ATM hall. Here's the transition between the lower floor and the kind of more, shall we say, odd or off colors into a world of sort of warm colors and materials like wood. The plan for the project, as in all of them, is very straightforward. Small offices that you go to after you've sort of hung out in a lounge space. It's a private banking office. There's no money, no transactions, signing a few documents and so forth. It's a very, very straightforward world. Here's the circulation bay. And essentially this world right here is all about movement, and this world is about kind of repose and the sedentary. And the relationship between pure movement and the sedentary is what we were trying to articulate in the ceiling. Where you move only, the soffit is a line. It's a sloped line that's a kind of demising line between the circulation bay and the interior. Of course, right beyond that is the door. It continues as a line till you get to the point of this field. Then the soffit essentially spreads into a plate rather than a line. So at the level of the ceiling surface, we want the ceiling surface to essentially be a map or a diagram of the circulation for the project, to essentially project circulation and the logic of circulation, not as some funny kind of didactic thing, didactic maybe for me and you, but much, much more about the experiential nature of how lines work in terms of movement versus surfaces work in terms of a kind of point of repose. And it's essentially a repetitive system. Not quite the black and white project, but let's say the black and the dark wood as a high contrast moment, and 2 types of wood as the low contrast moment. Although it's a symmetrical set of figures along this line of structure, you never circulate on that line. So the symmetry is never really perceived. You're constantly moving on one side of the axis or the other, so the kind of dynamics of the room change quite a bit. There's also things like 500 millimeter radius is actually a conic surface that migrates down to 150 millimeter radius, about 6 inches. So we've got conic surfaces which are also constantly causing the ceiling surface to pitch in various directions, whether we pitch it because of the cone or we pitch it, let's say, because of a fold. You'll see a kink where we fold across the white plane. You can see a kink, a small kink right there. Oh, I'm sorry, there's the kink, where we're folding this surface, and that produces a kind of moment of noise in an otherwise kind of smooth world. And the other thing is, as you see the light, this kind of vague chiaroscuro, you can barely pick up where the radius is in this particular kind of world until you read it like a 2D drawing. So the relationship between that which is super clear and that which is sort of morphologically vague, this is absolutely part of the agenda of the project, to pull those realms together, to pull that level of immediacy together into the world of the vague. Because, you know, we're not architects, personally, who's interested in holding up a mirror to the world that says, the world's really complex, so we'll just make our stuff complex because that's the most relevant thing we can do. Actually, quite a lot is we're trying to make things super clear, but not in a reductive or minimalist kind of way, including all the lighting system, which of course creates, for us, part of the black and white project. I'll stop here. I have a few more to show, but these are a whole series of them that we did along the same sort of DNA. I want to thank you again for inviting me. Thank you very much for your patience. I want to say thank you to my team who works so hard on these projects. Thank you.